Good afternoon. Administration is here today recommending that Council give second and third reading to borrowing bylaw 35/2021 for a solar farm. The presentation administration has prepared varies from the presentation that we would normally give for a borrowing bylaw. It covers off both a refresher of drivers for this project, which were not a focus in the project charter presentation in June, given they've been publicly discussed in the past. And it also provides representing some information from the feasibility study presented with the project charter in June, and an update on work currently in progress, but not finalized under phase 3 of the project, which has been the focus of late. This variance from the normal practice is to provide clarity, but also to identify what is not clear yet in response to external drivers and questions from residents since the first reading. We will explain the phases of the project in this presentation. However, briefly to frame the overall presentation, we are currently in phase 3, which is detailed design, the deliverables for which include a detailed design package. Design was at 30% in June, not 100%. It is not done. It will include a financial summary and revenue strategy recommendations. It will include operations and maintenance requirements. In other words, looking at the entire life cycle of the project. It will include permitting, agreements, and regulatory and public engagement. While there are different permutations of approaching a project, the path being currently taken, inclusive of future decision gates and public engagement, is within the goalposts for governance processes and project management practices, both public and private. I've done many capital projects in both areas. It is a matter of tweaking these as the project progresses based on the information gained. So a little bit about the background again. So setting the context. These financial challenges have been publicly discussed on many occasions since the beginning of Council's term, and even before that. And with the passing of time, they're ever more omnipresent and significant. There are no scare tactics. I will be presenting the financial wall budget this fall. We have all heard last year in the middle of the pandemic from the province of the fiscal reckoning coming in Alberta. That fiscal reckoning has a trickle-down effect into municipalities and compounds the financial challenges identified prior to the pandemic. We have decreasing revenues, such as a 25% reduction in capital grant funding from the province. We are having slower revenue recovery from COVID, and I think that's going to be even slower than we're projecting with the situation we're currently in. And there are many other measures in the 2021 provincial budget that have affected our available funding for services and capital projects. As we've increased expenses, such as borrowing costs on Ray Gibbon Drive, mandated policing and transit contract increases, operating impacts of the pending annexation, and infrastructure deficit funding. We have talked publicly about our growth capital budget, which despite Council rationalizing, still remains underfunded. And we have talked about our repair, maintain, and replace shortfall and the need to establish a surtax to maintain our infrastructure we already have in place. If nothing else changes, faced with decreasing revenues and increasing expenses, higher than historical tax increases are needed to remain whole. Our forecast is for at least 5% increases annually going forward for the foreseeable future. We can likely mitigate 2022 to a degree with the measures we took through COVID, but that opportunity won't be likely present in 2023 and beyond. And finally, if the past is an indicator of the future, it would be prudent to anticipate externally driven emerging costs in the future, not accounted for in our current forecasting. So it is clearly understood what do nothing or just accepting the status quo and increasing property taxes will result in. The following graph is based on an average St. Albert single family home that we use every year in our budgeting, assessed at $435,000. The total change to the municipal tax rate over 10 years is an increase of 63% if we have 5% tax increases, versus 19.5% if we were able to maintain our tax increases at 1.8%, which has been the average for the last 10 years. In terms of dollars, this means paying $1,607 more a year in 10 years' time with 5% tax increases instead of 1.8% tax increases. This graph does not contemplate physical growth or increases to either the education or homeland requisitions. We've put them in there as a placeholder. I mean, It's not a rate the city sets. We don't know what will happen with those in the future, but there could be increases in those as well. So in the last slide, I talked about increasing taxes to maintain the status quo, including the current revenue deficit in the absence of any other actions. The other option is to reduce services and service levels to the community, the combined community, inclusive of residents, businesses, and community partners. Reducing services and service levels in St. Albert is not without challenge. St. Albert continually ranks #1 in quality of life with comparator communities in Alberta. This was the most recent full survey taken in 2019. Much of that quality of life comes from the services and service levels the city offers. Normally we do these surveys every 2 years, but we did do a modified survey in 2020 to see if the pulse of the community had changed significantly at that time in the pandemic, and generally it had not. We will be doing another survey this fall, in the late fall, as regularly scheduled. And what these surveys over the years have told us is that St. Albert residents value the services and service levels, with the largest segment, and in this case the majority of respondents, willing to support inflationary tax increases to maintain the services and service levels. This is not the case in all communities. Some communities are willing to accept reductions in services and service levels to mitigate tax impacts to zero or reduce them. And we see these in these comparator communities. We review all of them. But this has historically been the case in St. Albert. So again, the next survey will tell us if St. Albert has changed its position on this. In recent years prior to the pandemic, administration initiated a number of cost-saving and efficiency initiatives to maintain tax increases below the municipal price index and inflation, and hold our position of below average operating costs per capita. Administration followed up on these measures with the recommendation to council to undertake an operational and fiscal review in mid-2020, which was adopted and completed prior to the summer recess this year. The operational and fiscal review recommendations from Ernst & Young, partially in recognition of the short-term measures taken by both council and administration, recommended a number of mid to long-term cost-saving and efficiency opportunities, which administration has developed a plan for and has initiated work on many of them, with the remainder to be looked at in the next couple of years based on prioritizations provided by Ernst & Young. But what the review by Ernst & Young also said was that the city must look for new opportunities to explore new revenue streams to ease financial pressures. There is no silver bullet to the fiscal sustainability issue. The solar farm by itself is not the silver bullet, and cost side management by itself is not the silver bullet. Multiple revenue and expense initiatives are needed. Elaborating on our cost side management in the last slide, every year the province publishes the operating expense per capita for Alberta municipalities. Historically, St. Albert has had below average operating expenses per capita relative to our peer municipalities, and this trend continued in 2020. The Canadian Taxpayer Federation also compared these in 2019, and our position relative to our peers was generally the same, and this has been presented publicly previously. However, this data is also not necessarily comparing apples to apples, and this is where services and service levels established by councils come in. For example, not all communities have a theater or the tree canopy that St. Albert does. So going forward, the main determinant in cost side management will be the services and service levels provided by the city, complemented by mainly long-term efficiency, efficiency opportunities identified in the operational and fiscal review. So to sum up where we stand today, in the absence of new revenue, if we want St. Albert to stay the same, we need higher taxes and service cuts. If we want lower taxes, we need service cuts and building up and in and business growth. And if we want current services, we need higher taxes and building up and in and business growth. At the end of the day, we can't have current services, low taxes, and St. Albert remaining the same as it is. That outcome does not exist. In fact, St. Albert can't stay the same and conform to the Regional Growth Plan, a provincially approved statutory plan. There's been a lot of effort into build up and in with the land use bylaw amendments and business growth, but it's not going to solve our issues anytime soon, which I'll explain a bit further. So Council's strategic plan focused on establishing a growth policy framework, enhancing business and commercial growth, and integrating the city's transportation systems. This has been intentional to grow the city's non-residential tax base and improve overall financial sustainability. There has been significant progress on this front, with major successes including Flourish, the land use bylaw amendments, and the soon-to-be completed annexation with Sturgeon County, which gives us a goal of 70 to 30 residential and the MDP, and a land supply to grow for a number of decades. Council also invested in strategic infrastructure projects to foster economic development, notably the $27 million investment in Ray Gibbon Drive, which has seen almost an immediate return of $90 million in private sector investment along the corridor. We are seeing success in organically moving the dial on the residential to non-residential tax ratio. Organically means new business growth and not transferring the residential tax burden to the existing businesses. So despite the pandemic, 2020 had the third highest number of building and mechanical permits in St. Albert since 2008. Total permit revenue last year was also the fourth highest since 2008. St. Albert led the region in Q3 and Q4 in industrial area construction. That includes Edmonton. We were number one. 2020 construction permit values exceeded $200 million and exceeded 2019 by more than 40%. Success continues in 2021, albeit with a bit more of a residential focus this year, but we're still seeing good non-residential performance. So through July of this year, year-to-date single-family building permits are up 147%. Year-to-date building permits, all types, are up 48%. Year-to-date new construction is up 37%. So at this point, one may ask, what's the point of all this? What's the problem, or how does it relate to the solar farm? As a result of this success, available service land, emphasis on service land, within the city is quickly shrinking, which likely means additional city investments in infrastructure will be required to maintain momentum towards that 70-30 tax ratio. The last thing we want to do is lose this momentum, as it will take years to rebuild investment confidence to overcome running out of land, which means additional infrastructure investments, municipal investments, will be required. This means without new revenue, the currently reduced pot for capital projects will have to be spread further and will make investment decisions for all the capital projects on the books more difficult, and the list of unfunded projects will grow, whether it's be existing projects or infrastructure investment projects, if this is what the council decides to continue to enable growth to reach our goals. Please bear with me for another couple slides to explain the timing of the gains from non-residential investment growth. So when comparing cities in Alberta, St. Albert remains one of the highest residential tax bases at almost 80% residential to 20% non-residential. So what does this mean? It means that if we use a community in the middle of the range, such as Leduc, at 63% residential to 37% non-residential, that when we and they both buy $100 of diesel for a sanding truck, Leduc residents pay $63 of the $100, and St. Albert residents pay $80 of that same $100 for the same product made at the same refinery and hauled a comparable distance. So when a resident says their taxes are high in St. Albert, they are right, but it is predominantly due to the tax ratio, not the city's operating costs. It also means that future tax increases, projected to be higher in the past, will be mostly borne by residential property owners. So with our successes, it looks like we're on the road to reaching 70-30, which provides residential taxation relief, albeit still above average residential tax burden in the region. However, the real issue is how long will it take us to get there? So from 2008 to 2019, the city moved from 85-15 to its goal of 80-20. So it took us 10 years or more to move 5%. Our new goal requires us to move another 10%. If we stay at the same rate, it will take us 20 years to reach that goal. Perhaps we're moving faster based on our success, and if we can continue that momentum, the goal would still be 10 or 15 years out, while we have increased taxation in front of us right now. So if we tackle increased taxation for the next few years, we need another source of revenue, as non-residential growth revenue will not address the problem in the near future. That source of revenue is non-traditional revenue. The solar farm is a non-traditional revenue opportunity, and it can help to mitigate tax increases and service level impacts, associated with decreasing revenues and increasing costs. There's an excellent site here that residents can check if they like on various, why municipalities are ideal solar generators, as it says. So that's a separate independent organization. Municipalities, of course, have limited revenue opportunities available. One of the few revenue opportunities outside of the standard ones is municipally controlled corporations. Another point is other new revenue streams often compete with local or regional businesses. So the point of this slide is the solar farm is a non-traditional revenue source, and it does not require a municipal controlled corporation, and it has limited to no impact on businesses, specifically direct competition with existing St. Albert businesses. Switching gears a little bit, should only a financial lens be applied to this project? Should only an environmental lens be applied to this project? Should both lenses be applied in decision making? Should the social lens be applied as well to consider the triple bottom line or sustainability in decision making? In this context, applying the social lens could be solar farm revenue proceeds used to sustain current city funding to social profit and business sector organizations, which could be at risk in the next few years, given services and service levels may have to be reduced to mitigate tax impacts. Could it be used to help build new arenas that the community has said it wants? And there's many partners out there seeking to build arenas with us. That is one possibility, or these are more, two possibilities, I guess, and something for council to ultimately decide. This is a slide that I used 10 years ago. It's still very relevant. It's from Scientific American in 2011. And as it says, all climate is local. Mayors are often better equipped than presidents to cut greenhouse gases. In some ways, cities may be in a better position than nations to do something about climate change. Climate change is a global issue that requires local solutions for the best effect. Each community has its own circumstances, conditions, abilities, opportunities, and attributes that it can utilize to do its part in tackling this issue. A little bit about the technology. So photovoltaic solar panels produce DC electricity, which is converted to AC through the use of an inverter. Medicine Hat, an example some in the community are comparing this solar proposal to, as was said earlier tonight by one of the delegates, was piloting a very different experimental technology that essentially uses parabolic mirrors to concentrate solar energy to heat a tube of oil, which transfers the heat to produce steam used in a traditional combined cycle electrical generation plant. Medicine Hat adapted an existing natural gas-fired plant for this purpose. While this technology has been shown to make economic sense in other parts of the world and was proven to be technically feasible in a cold climate, it was not shown to be commercially viable in Alberta, given its high maintenance costs and our low natural gas prices. That is why Medicine Hat discontinued their solar farm. Solar PV is becoming very common technology adopted by a number of communities, including Sexsmith, Bonaccord, Vulcan, Innisfil, Raymond, Viking, to name a few. Again, I refer back to the link I provided earlier. It's also already been employed by the city at our transit facility, our public works facility, and we're currently installing one of the larger arrays in the province on top of Service Place. No doubt the solar farm proposed is larger and ambitious relative to some other projects, but these solar farms will continue to grow in size. A few of the site considerations to be looked at are distance to grid interconnections, topography, soil conditions, distance from other developments. So these are some of the factors that are under consideration in phase 3 detailed design. A little bit more on the environmental side. So solar is a significantly more efficient source of clean and sustainable energy. This renewable energy source generates 3 to 25 times less emissions than generating the same amount of energy from fossil fuels. In 2019, the city's greenhouse gas emissions reduced nearly 11%. The city's most recent greenhouse gas emissions target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% below 2008 levels by 2020. So the Environment Branch is working with strategic services to explore updating our greenhouse gas target. A 15.1 megawatt DC solar farm has the potential to reduce over 10,800 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, which is equivalent to removing 3,300 passenger cars off the road or offsetting over 2,500 single-family homes for the year. City-owned use to offset the city's grid electricity consumption would result in up to an estimated 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2008 levels, so well exceeding our current target. While we're on our way and making good progress towards our greenhouse gas reduction goals, the yardstick continues to move. We are starting to see even more ambitious goals emerging in response to ongoing climate change issues, such as a federal target of 40 to 45% reductions by 2030, and the City of Edmonton target 50% reductions by 2030. So the solar farm has the opportunity to enable St. Albert to set a more ambitious goal. So now the borrowing bylaw. The borrowing bylaw is a step in the process legislated by the Municipal Government Act. We are not borrowing the money now, nor necessarily all of it or any of it, and maybe none of it all at once. The projected costs continue to be refined through the design phase. As an example, for Project 9, the new sewer line up along Sturgeon Road, the approved borrowing limit was $30 million in the borrowing bylaw, and the city only actually borrowed $12 million as costs were refined through the design process. As well, Fire Hall 4 borrowing bylaw was approved on July 6th of this year. It is not intended to be actioned until such a time as we can assess the viability of new alternative built forms, which may ultimately lead to a less expensive project. So work is in progress to provide the most prudent product for the city, and we have not borrowed any money in the last 6 weeks. It's not an instantaneous borrowing when these things happen. The borrowing bylaw approval ensures that financing does not impact the project scheduling, but provides funding once the project commences, if it commences. So, another example of that is the borrowing bylaw for the branch library, which there was a borrowing bylaw in place. The project was never done, and there was never any money taken out as a loan against that project. So what does what I just said mean? Oops, sorry. St. Albert has historically typically chosen to debt finance the entire project, inclusive of both pre-construction and construction phases. Some municipalities only debt finance construction. In fact, this is my experience, and I suggest that it may be something we may want to do this way going forward. This means that the borrowing bylaw is only for construction when final design is done and funded by another means, and there is much more certainty around the project, its merits, and its costs. This is easier to do in communities with high growth or periods of high growth, such as booms, and ones that have a lower residential to non-residential tax ratio. So historically in St. Albert, we've had steady growth, but we haven't had the big booms and busts, and we've already discussed the tax ratio. Either approach is permissible, and each has pros and cons depending on the community and the situation. It is not an impossibility to only borrow for construction in St. Albert, but it has been historical practice in St. Albert to borrow for pre-construction and construction. One way to think of a borrowing bylaw is like a mortgage pre-approval in the house purchasing process. Just because you are pre-approved doesn't necessarily mean that you will use it, and if you do, that you'll use the maximum amount you are pre-approved for. Once pre-approved, it allows you to do the legwork in the buying process, like house hunting, making an offer, meeting conditions, and then closing. Phase 3, which we'll talk about, is the detailed design in the process. And it's analogous to these home pre-purchase steps, which are decision gates in the house purchase, such as house inspection results, encroachments, liens, and the bank's approval, or appraisal, any of which may cause you to decide not to buy the house, or your financer to not let you purchase the house. The key difference is once all the conditions are removed on a house, it's hard for the home buyer to not close the deal without liability. Whereas with a borrowing bylaw and the financer being the loaning institution, but really the City of St. Albert controlling that, the project does not have to proceed to construction, where the vast majority of the debenture borrowing occurs. If the situation has changed, the city needs to reprioritize projects, etc. So now a little bit about the project. And the major points I've heard from the delegates tonight is violent agreement with the project plan. all saying the same thing administration is saying. Unfortunately, it seems like there is confusion around city processes that has led to this. The borrowing bylaw is not a decision point on the solar farm from a project development, decision, and implementation basis, or in other words, the project's merits or lack of merits. The borrowing bylaw process is running concurrent with the project, which at this point is in phase 3. The borrowing bylaw is not part of the process to make technical or business decisions on implementing, such as building the project or not, other than the project doesn't proceed to a final decision to build or not if a funding source to complete pre-construction activities, in this case, the approval of a borrowing bylaw, is not in place. Of course, the borrowing bylaw is also an important decision, and with the traditional borrowing practices in St. Albert, there are two processes running concurrently and at the moment butting heads in a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Good information is needed to make good decisions, but funding is needed to gather good information to make good decisions. Non-contentious projects such as Ray Gibbon Drive and Fire Hall 4 are recent borrowing bylaws that were not deemed contentious and proceeded according to St. Albert's historical practices. So it's not so much about the processes historically employed. Perhaps it is more about having the right process for the nature of the project being considered, such that they work together instead of working against each other. So looking at the project timelines and decision gates on the screen, phases 1 and 2 were feasibility phases at 30% design, not 100% design. That was the information that came forward to council in June when the project charter was approved. The project is currently in phase 3, which is concurrent with the borrowing bylaw before council this evening. It has a long way to go. It will be 12 months before phase 3, where detailed design is complete. Once phase 3 is complete, there is a decision gate, and council would be informed if administration is proceeding or not to phase 4, which is ready for tender. Again, there's another decision gate when the project is ready for tender, and council would be informed if administration is proceeding to construction or not. At any decision gate, a council member could make inquiries and/or notice a motion for council to debate whether to continue the project if that council member had concerns with the project proceeding to the next phase. For phase 5, there's also an option to phase construction and assess system performance after the first construction phase to make a decision to proceed or not with the second and third construction phases. In terms of project financing, separate debentures could be taken out for each construction phase to minimize overall financial risk on the project. But back to phase 3, where we're at in the process currently, it's inclusive of completing design work, looking at the life cycle of the project, which includes operations, maintenance, and closure costs, such as decommissioning and final disposition of equipment, and site remediation and reclamation of the site to the appropriate criteria, depending on the future land use. In other words, it will look at the cradle to the grave of the project. It also includes financial analysis, both of revenues and costs, regulatory applications, and public engagement. There is still much work to do and many questions to be answered, not only for council and the public, but for administration as well. I will comment for a moment about the administration resources on this project. In addition to other functions in production and professions, there are in-house practicing engineers, accountants, and lawyers working on the team. Going off the top of my head and not looking at their CVs, team members combined have worked for 5 public and private utility operations, inclusive of electricity, natural gas, and environmental utilities, and 3 major Canadian energy companies. It is also too important to note that their professional practice standards and codes of ethics drive their decision-making, and that they also stay in their lane and scope of practice and seek out external competent professionals such as electrical engineers when needed. The party we retained to help us is ATCO. On their team, they have a solar engineer, a distribution engineer, civil engineers, as well as environmental remediation and wildlife specialists. They've been involved in at least 11 solar projects in central and northern Alberta. So next, let's talk a little bit about the cash flow for the project. So council provided funding to complete phases 1 and 2, the feasibility, and there are some of these funds remaining to commence work on phase 3, but not enough to complete it. Hence the borrowing bylaw before you today based on the city's historical practices. So the borrowing bylaw proposed is to complete phase 3 and for phases 4 and 5. Phase 5, which is construction, could be staged with separate debentures for each stage with pros and cons relative to completing it in one phase. Initial reviews suggest that the reduced financial benefits from a staged construction approach would have to be weighed against the benefits of limiting the city's financial risk. Additional work is required to fully understand the implications of a staged approach to Phase 5, and this would be a future decision should the project continue to progress. As shown by the relative cash flows, the pre-construction activities are marginal in relative cost, and the significant proportion of funds for construction are not at risk if a borrowing bylaw is passed today, with the decision gates in the project still to come. So construction would begin in 2023, which is where you would start to take out, I didn't do the numbers, but looks like 95% of the funding for this project. So a little bit more about Phase 3. There's a number of considerations that require further analysis. We need to further analyze the impact of off-site levy bylaws, which is not currently in the project costs. According to the off-site levy bylaw, development on the Badger lands will incur up to $8.9 million in cost to the city when a development permit for a solar farm on the site is received. However, this dollar amount is likely higher than what a typical subdivision development on the property would be. There's municipal reserve for about 10% of the area and POLs for stormwater management for about 7%. These are exempt from off-site levies according to the bylaw. As well, phasing of payments and the period of these, which the city enables private developers to do, needs to be considered. Practically, the off-site levy bylaw as it stands now does not consider a development like this, and it will not consume the off-site infrastructure like a normal development would when looking at these relative contributions to traffic and water and wastewater capacity. But ultimately, there's a future land use beyond the solar farm as well. So there's lots to look at in that area. Fowler Way and upgrading of Villeneuve Road will both have components on the Badger lands, and the relative impacts of these projects on each other is being incorporated into the considerations. Probably the most complex component with many different considerations and permutations in Phase 3 is the financial analysis and all the related cascading items for supporting business and operating model options. Inputs to the operating and business models will be various considerations, including, again, operational options, such as city-owned and operated, commercially operated, lease arrangements, and partnerships or joint venture opportunities. And inputting to those will be considerations such as tax impacts, grant opportunities, and available markets that each of those options provide. As already discussed, additional work is required on construction phasing. And finally, public engagement is necessary as part of the regulatory application process. However, the minimum engagement requirements for the application are focused on property owners in proximity to the project site and not the broader population of St. Albert for a project involving borrowing with public funds. So the city is considering enhanced public engagement with the broader population in Phase 3 near its completion once further work is done to refine the project parameters being discussed this evening. So recognizing these two processes, project development and project financing, are effectively bashing heads as they're running concurrently, and the historical practice of requesting the authorization of debenture funding early in the project life in St. Albert, when there's still significant information to be collected and analyzed and options and strategies to be looked at, administration has prepared an alternative motion to better integrate these two processes, should council wish to consider it. So to circle back, new revenue is a strategy to help solve the dilemma that St. Albert is not alone in facing. New revenue includes both new non-residential growth and organic residential building up and in, or densification, and non-traditional revenue to relieve existing and potentially growing residential tax burden without shifting it to local businesses. We are seeing substantive progress in growing non-traditional revenue. We're seeing substantive progress in growing non-residential growth, some of the best performance that St. Albert has seen. However, its pace is not aligned with near-term substantive tax impacts in order to mitigate them. Non-traditional revenue, such as a solar farm, notwithstanding its environmental and potential social benefits, and applying only the financial lens, is an opportunity to potentially mitigate near-term tax impacts and moderate reductions in existing services and service levels. In the absence of new revenue opportunities, taxes will have to be increased significantly higher than historical increases, and/or services and service levels offered to the community will have to be reduced. Increasing taxes would be counter to the results of the current St. Albert Gazette poll regarding issues important to voters for the upcoming municipal election, which has the #1 issue at 28.5% of respondents about increasing taxes, with the next closest issue at 11.3%. The solar farm is fourth at 8.1%. That was as of 1:28 this afternoon. So there's lots to consider and balance. At this point in the project, there are many questions that remain to be answered, not only for council and the taxpayers, but also for administration. Answers to those questions are currently being sought in the current phase of the project. But overall, is the strategy to find new revenue, increase taxes, or decrease services, or some combination of these, given that doing nothing does not exist? Relying on internal controls and decision gates, at each of which council will be informed of the status of the project, which will indicate the viability of the project, and it can then act if it deems necessary, or implementing further council controls and decision gates, which will extend timelines of the project implementation, are things that need to be considered. Going fast to optimize financial benefits, such as current limited window for carbon credits, and to realize these sooner with the city's current financial challenges, or go slower, reducing the optimal financial benefits and incurring additional costs, such as multiple regulatory applications for phase construction, but also providing opportunity to limit the city's financial risk. Those are things that need to be considered. Is this project about finances, the city contributing to mitigating a global issue, or both? What is for sure is the financial wall that has been discussed regularly in public meetings over the past few years is now here, and council has the burden of choosing the path for the community. So in summary, the community needs to pick a lane soon. Increase taxes, reduce services, new revenue sources, or some combination of these are the lanes. The city's fiscal sustainability is a higher level issue, driving potential revenue generating projects like the solar farm. That is the driver, but that is not the issue before council today. Is the solar farm a good project for the city or not? This is unknown at this time. $135,000 is needed to get that answer. If you want the answer, how will you fund it? With the proposed borrowing bylaw, which is the traditional method the city has employed in the past, or with the alternative presented by administration? Alternatively, if funding in some form is not provided, phase 3 of the project does not proceed, and another lane will have to be selected by council and the community. It's not administration's place to pick the lane. So that concludes my presentation. Happy to take any questions.